Give me a moment to share the screen. Yes. Good evening to everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for the Madras Day celebrations of Savita Engineering College, despite it being a Saturday evening. My association with the Savita group of institutions has been for a long time. I've had the privilege of meeting Dr. Savita and being enjoying her hospitality on a couple of occasions when I've spoken at the pupil school. And it's my absolute pleasure to participate in this particular event, having spent 2.5 years researching the Kuam, and ever since that's almost, every year I've been speaking on the Kuam in various forums. So it's an absolute pleasure to be with you here today. I had deliberately taken this topic looking at Madras from the Kuam, because when you look at Madras, when you are speaking about Madras, when you are discussing the development of the city to what it is that you see today, in every step, the Kuam River has been associated. So you cannot remove Kuam out of the picture when you're discussing about Madras. And if you look at the map, if you were to look, of course, you would definitely know this information. But then if you were to see, for the Savita group of institutions, the Kuam River is just in your backyard. And, from the water that is collected from the river through damming it at Kesavaram is then sent to the Chembrambakam Lake, which is also very close to where you're situated. So, ideal that we're talking about the Kuam today. So when we speak about the Kuam, this is the impression that most of us have. So this is the impression that we get. It's a dirty river, it's slimy, it's sluggish. There are a lot of huts and, very simple tenements around the river. And, the bad stink, because anything that looks like a sewage gutter, anything that looks like a cesspool, we start calling it the Kuam, irrespective of whether it is actually the Kuam or not. Even when there were floods in the Adyar River in December 2015, where the entire city of Madras was flooded, there were several news channels which were reporting that the Kuam was flooded simply because for them, any dirty river is equivalent to the Kuam. Now, if you look at the number of water bodies in Madras city, of course, I think if you were to look at the maps of about 150, 200 years ago, there were 250 water bodies that were there in the place that we call Madras today. The three main rivers that are associated with the city of Madras, we have the Kortalyar or the Kusasthalai River, which is in the northern portion of the map. You can see that. Kuam River flows right in the middle of the city, dividing the city almost into two equal halves. And then you have the Adyar River, which is on the southern side. So these are the three main rivers. And if you look at the left corner of the map on your screen, you would find that the Kuam River is actually a distributary of the Kusasthalai River or the Kortalyar, and it splits into two at Kesavaram. There's a better picture which I will show you in a minute. But then let's talk about what this Kuam River is all about. Does it have anything at all to discuss beyond it being a cesspool that we are talking about today? So if we were to look at what Kuam is all about, then you would be surprised to know that the Kuam actually has its own Puranam. And this Puranam is part of the 18 Puranams that have been there from time immemorial, and they have been in text from the 3rd century BC onwards. And, in the Skanda Puranam, in the Kalika Kandam, there is a separate chapter for the Kuva Puranam, which states that this river actually emerged from the feet of Lord Shiva when Lord Shiva was going to burn the Tripura Asuras. And then because he forgot to worship Ganesha, Ganesha broke the axle of the chariot. So when the chariot was falling, Shiva stood with holding his bow onto the ground. And when the bow hit the ground, the water from the Vritta Shira Nadi, which is the Paraya Palare, sprang forth, washed his feet, and then it kind of flowed forward. And that is why it is called Kuvam. The word Kuvam actually means water under the ground. So Kuva Kalanyargal were the people who were the water diviners in those days, who would come and check in every site where the water actually is and where a well could be dug. So because this river was under the ground and it came out when Lord Shiva's bow touched the ground, it came to be called as Kuvam. And the Kuva Puranam says, even those sins that are not washed away by bathing in the river Ganges will get washed away if a person bathes in the Kuvam. So this is the geographical image where you see the Kusasthalai river is splitting into two at Kesavaram, and the right arm proceeds as Kuvam, and it's a 72-kilometer river, out of which 40 kilometers is in Tiruvallur district, and the remainder is in within the city limits of Madras. And then it joins the Bay of Bengal near the Napier Bridge, close to the marina. Right. Now we'll talk about how this whole city of Madras came into being. Now the Britishers were the last of the European powers to come to India. Earlier, the Portuguese were already there, the Dutch were there, the French were there. So when the British initially in the late 1500s, what they were doing was that they were making business trips to India. So they would take a ship, and then the merchants would share the costs between themselves, and then they would come to India, they would purchase long cloth, they would purchase painted cloth, which possibly was the kalamkari, which was being done around the Kalahasti, Machilipatnam area. And then they were purchasing calico cloth, all this, and then they were going back, selling it in the UK, and then splitting the profits between themselves. So at that time, a need was felt for a more permanent base for them in India. And that is when the first place that they purchased was an already existing fort in a place called Durgarayapattanam, which is on the northern tip of the Pulicat Lake. And this place, they actually took over a fort, and they wanted to produce cloth there. But then nothing much happened, because the Nawab was very, very suspicious of these white men, the locals. And since, that was the population was very, very less in that place, they couldn't get the labor, they could not get, transportation. There was terrible malaria there. So already, people around them were dying because of the mosquitoes. So nothing much happened, although they acquired this place, and then they called it Armagon, because there was a person called Armuga Mudaliar who had actually helped them to acquire this place. So in respect of him, they named their factory, the fort, as Armagon, but then nothing much happened there. And that was when Francis Day was tasked with the responsibility of finding a better place where they could set up their base. So what Francis Day did was he contacted Damarla Venkatappa Nayak, who was he belonged to the Nayaks of Kalahasti, and he was a representative of the Vijayanagara king Venkata III. So Francis Day spoke to him and asked him to provide a plot of land which is close to the sea for an annual rent of about 600 pounds. So Venkatadri Nayak agreed to it, because the problem was there was the Elumbur River to the north of the place that Francis Day was asking, and there was the Triplicane River, which is the Kuvam River's old name. So the Triplicane River and Elumbur River were there, and this was a sandy plot of land in between, which was of no use to these Britishers. So as a result of it, they were more than happy to give it on a lease to the, this was of no use to the Vijayanagara kingdom. So they were more than happy to give it to the Britishers on lease. So on 22nd of August 1639, a grant agreement was signed again on the banks of the Kuvam, very close to where you are in Poonamalli, between Venkatadri Nayak and Francis Day. And then both of them traveled along with Andrew Cohen, who was the supervisor of Francis Day, to Chandragiri, which was at that time the headquarters of the Vijayanagara Empire. They met King Venkata III, who ratified this agreement. And what you see on the right side of your screen is the inscription that is still available in the Chandragiri Palace to denote that it was there that the grant of land to the Britishers, the agreement was signed. And now this apparently was signed in gold. It was a golden sheet on which it was signed, and this had been placed in the Fort St. George. Now what happened to that document is something we will see later in the presentation. Right. So first they purchased this plot of land. They set up a small fort house where the the merchant governors or the whoever was heading the East India Company at that point in time had to stay. And then there were a lot of temporary settlements for the workers who were constructing the fort at that point in time. And Francis Day also invited other people who like Portuguese who he could trust, or very wealthy Indians who he thought were okay to come and settle in within the fort were invited to come and construct their houses there. But for everybody else, they created something called Blacktown, which was outside of Fort St. George. These were basically the support services and the weavers and all that who would provide services to the actually operations of the fort in itself. So although the agreement was signed in 1639, the fort was completed only in 1644, and since it was completed on the day of the birthday of the patron saint of England, it was named after him as Fort St. George. Of course, the fort house was subsequently demolished, and the building that you see here, which is the current Secretariat building, came up in its place. Because then, the governor's residence moved to where the new Secretariat was built, which is a hospital currently. And then, of course, they had the Guindy Lodge, which then is now the governor's residence now. So once the construction of Fort St. George was completed, the next point that they started focusing on was to create the security system for the fort. Of course, there was, they had British soldiers who had come in and who were staying there. But beyond that, they felt that they also needed locals to be protecting the fort for them. So they started the Pedanayak system, which is somewhat of a forerunner of the police system that you see today. So the Pedanayaks were appointed, they were Indians who were appointed to guard the fort. And they also developed a bodyguard system for the governor. And these were a combination of, these were Hindus who had been trained, and there were combinations of different communities to make sure that they weren't kind of conniving to kill the governor or anything like that. And apparently, at one point, there were up to 700 bodyguards who were in the service of protecting the governor. An interesting fact to note, of course, two interesting facts to note here is that it wasn't as if there was no guarding system prior to the British introducing it here in India. You get inscriptions from the Chola period itself, which speaks about Padikaval and Urkaval. Padikaval meaning the protection of the military base, and Urkaval is, of course, protection of the households. And then how taxes were levied in order to pay the people who were employed as these Kavalkarals. So the governor's bodyguards had two places of worship on the banks of the Kuam, which are still there. The bodyguard mosque, which you can actually see if you're turning from Simpson towards Chindadripet, you can actually see the bodyguard mosque from there. And of course, the very famous bodyguard Munishwaran temple, where the Hindu guards went to worship. Right. Now, the other most important thing, so one was the protection of the fort in itself, and second was to take care of their soldiers. So they developed the first British hospital within India. It was opened within Fort St. George in 1664. And this was the, initially it was reserved only for the British soldiers. And then, it subsequently moved out. As it expanded, it moved out and it came to its present location, which is the Rajiv Gandhi GH, which is now called the Rajiv Gandhi Hospital, which is right opposite to the Central Station in 1772. So initially only the British were allowed to be treated there, but then subsequently when it moved here, it was opened up as a general hospital and anybody could go there for treatment. Another very, very interesting trivia associated with this is that the space opposite to the Central Station, there was a hill there, which was called Narimede or the Hog's Hill. And then the British broke that hill down, and in that place, then there was a house there, some private houses were there, and subsequently the general hospital was built in its place. So this was the next development on the banks of the Kuam. Now within the Fort St. George, they built the St. Mary's Church. So this was the first British church to the east of the Suez. And this church was built with subscriptions from the officers within the Fort St. George. So it was not a government building, but more, a crowd-funded church at that point in time. So the church came up first, and the spire was built subsequently in 1692. And although it was a place of worship, it has been put to various uses over time. So when the French siege happened, it was used as a barrack. And then subsequently, when they were fighting with Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, it was used as a storehouse. Because the dome, although they hadn't planned it to be like that, because of the peculiar way in which the dome was constructed, this building became bulletproof. So whatever they had to safeguard at the time of these wars that were going on the banks of the Kuam, they made sure that they put that stuff within the church. And they would kind of let out the church to the other regiments also. When there was a Swiss regiment visiting, they were conducting service there in French. And then, again, they were, when the Hanoverian regiment was visiting, there was services being conducted in German. All this was going on. Now, if you were to visit the St. Mary's Church, you would see that there is this register which talks about any British officer that you can identify with, you would have some entry there that had happened during his time. So you would have Robert Clive and Elihu Yale's marriages that were solemnized in this church. Then you would find that there are a number of tombstones that are placed in and around the church. Now, what happened was actually the graveyard was outside of Fort St. George, where the High Court building currently is. But then the tombstones were used as a cover for the French when they were fighting against the British. So they would hide behind these tombstones and then aim and shoot at the fort. So what they did is, after the war got over, they removed all the tombstones and brought it and put them all around the St. Mary's Church. So there are not bodies there actually around the church, but then the tombstones have been placed there for safekeeping. Right. Now, Ripon Building, you see on your right side, Ripon Building is relatively a very new building. Came up only in 1902, so relatively a new building when in compared to all the other buildings that we are talking about this evening. But then the corporation, the Madras Corporation, which is now the Greater Chennai Corporation, is the second oldest in the world, and it was brought into force in 1688. So this in 1687, Sir Josiah Child, who was the then chairman of East India Company, and Elihu Yale, they brought together a plan for the formation of a corporation, because by then the East India Company was also fully involved in administration, because they had started acquiring a lot of villages around Fort St. George, where they were getting people to weave cloth for them, they were getting other services and so on. So they required a separate administrative body. So it was agreed that the corporation would be composed of both Britishers as well as they would be Indians, and then it will be equipped with the mayor, an alderman, a burgess, and then there would be a recorder and a town clerk. And what this corporation would do is they would hear and decide on petty cases, and they would also collect the property taxes from schools, town halls, and they would also run the prison. So pretty much similar to the work that the corporation is doing today. And this happens to be the second oldest corporation in the world, right? Now, I told you in the beginning of the presentation that there was an Erambur River, which was to the north of the land that Francis Day procured. And there was the Kuam River, which was then called the Triplicane River. Now, what would happen is both these rivers would get flooded during the rainy season. Now, Kuam is not a perennial river. It gets a lot of water, or it used to get a lot of water during the rainy season. And then when both the rivers that were running quite close to each other, in fact, they were really running parallel to each other at the place where the central station and the prison was there earlier. So what the British did was, we spoke about the Hogs Hill or the Nari Made. So they broke down the hill and they diverted the course of the river so that this kind of formed a loop. So the two rivers were joined with one another. As you see in the picture, this is the image of the fort in 1733. So you see right behind the fort is that island. So they created this island artificially, and this is the island grounds, which you still find as you go towards the from the Secretariat. So the island grounds current is also now under the charge of the armed forces. So that's where all the exhibitions happen regularly. So this island was created by the British by linking the Erambur River and the Triplicane River, and collectively they started calling this river as the Kuam River, right? So, right. So all this was fine. And then, they were procuring cloth and they were sending it out to the UK. They were getting diamonds from the mines of Golconda. So everything was going fine. And that was when in 1702, they faced the first siege of Fort St. George. So Daud Khan, who was the Nawab of Carnatic and the Subedar of Aurangzeb, who was the then Mughal emperor, he laid siege to Fort St. George for a period of 3 months. And at that point in time, because the fort did not have adequate military power to thwart his attack, Governor Thomas Pitt had to then negotiate for peace. And based upon the successful negotiations that were carried out between Daud Khan and the Governor Thomas Pitt, Daud Khan gave back the villages that he had captured prior to the siege from the British, which was Tiruvattiur, Nungambakam, Vyasarpadi, Kattivakam, and Satangadu to the west of Tiruvattiur, back to the East India Company. Now, the British till such time had been procuring cloth and then sending it out to UK. So they felt the need to reduce costs and also to start manufacturing cloth. So what they did was they decided to create a weavers township right in the heart of the city. And the place they chose was none other than the area which was Sunkurama Chetty's garden, which you see on the left side of the screen. So where you see that the Kuam is kind of flowing in a loop around that garden. So there was abundant supply of water, and then there were a lot of trees there. So if they had to tie the cloth, to dye it or to dry it or even to fold it, these trees would have come of great use to them. So this garden was 87 acres, and it had been given to Sunkurama Chetty, who was a very influential trader who actually had a godown, a warehouse right inside Fort St. George, by Governor Collett. But what the head of the East India Company, George Morton Pitt, what he did was that he found a flaw in the title deed of that garden. So he took it over and he converted it into the first special economic zone that you could call, and made it into Chinnataripeta. So these were small looms on which the cloth was woven. 230 families from Madurai and Udayarpalayam and different parts of Tamil Nadu were brought here. They were given long loans to build houses, and they were settled here. They were given tax rebates for manufacturing cloth and selling it to the East India Company. And then there was already a Adi Keshava Perumal temple there. So what the British did through Vennala Narayana Chetty, their Dubash, is build another temple known as the Adipurishwara temple. So the twin temples, so that these people could go there and worship. They also built a mosque there. So it was a completely developed township of weavers called Chindadripeta or Chinnataripeta, which was developed by the British there. Okay, now at this time in 1746, of course, till till the 1840s, the cloth was being produced in Chindadripet, and it was being marketed by the East India Company in the UK. Now in 1746, what happened was that now the British had grown in strength. They had annexed Veperi, Periamet, Perambur, Pudupakam. So they also wanted to start, they started targeting territories which were in French possession. So when they started doing this, the French were annoyed by this, and Dupleix wanted to attack Madras. And so there was initially, some battalion was sent out, and initially there was some firing. For some reason at that time, the commander Peyton, he left Fort St. George and moved to Bengal after this first kind of show of power attack happened. For some reason, he went away to Bengal. And so in 1746, the French force came and took over a rather weak Fort St. George, which did not have its commander, and there wasn't much that they could do to protect their fort. And so Robert Clive was at that time a very young clerk who had just joined. He was a homesick young boy who was actually contemplating suicide because he did not have friends and he didn't know what to do. He was an accounting clerk there. He actually walked all the way. He's supposed to have ran all the way to Kadalur, which is about 200 kilometers from Fort St. George, to inform to his supervisors in Fort St. David about the fact that Madras had fallen to the French. So from 1746 until 1748, the Fort St. George was in possession of the French. And it's only in 1749, because when the Battle of Austrian Succession was happening, Louisburg was given by the British back to the French, and in exchange for that, they got back Madras from the French here in India. Again, the French tried to capture Fort St. George again in 1758, And then there was a siege which lasted for about 9 months. But then this time the British were much better prepared. And so they were not, the French under General Lally were not successful in capturing Fort St. George. But what had happened was the Kuam and Chindadripet was the area where the enemy forces always camped, because there was plenty of water there and there was open space for them, for the armed forces to camp. And so there was a bridge that had actually been built, St. George's, the bridge of Fort St. George, which had been built on the Kuam. It was also called the Triplicane Bridge because he connected Fort St. George with Triplicane. So that bridge was broken down because they did not want the French to advance further. And it was only subsequently built back in 1805. So the Kuam has not only been the witness of the actual birth and the growth of Madras, it has also seen all these war phases that happened there. In 1746, the Battle of Adayar also happened. So 1746 is a very significant year as far as Madras and its rivers are concerned, because the battle of to capture Fort St. George happened at the banks of the Kuam, and the Battle of Adayar also happened in the same year. Right. Now, Kuam was home to the birth of the Indo-Saracenic style of architecture. Now, what was Indo-Saracenic architecture? This was a combination of both the Indian style of architecture, which is inspired by the Mughal architecture with the high domes, the round domes that were there on top, and of course the Gothic style of architecture, which the Britishers were used to. So Robert Chisholm was, we can say, somewhat of a father of Indo-Saracenic architecture. The first building that he built in this style was, of course, the Chepauk Palace in 1768. And then he went on to build the Victoria Public Hall. He built the Senate building of the University of Madras, P.R. and Sons. So all this were built with red stone and with cylindrical domes, or the conical structures that you see on top. So they were a combination of how an Indian building would look like and a British building. And this style of architecture came to be known as Indo-Saracenic architecture. So what work had been started by Robert Chisholm was carried forward by Namperumal Chetty, and all the other red buildings that you see on first line and second line beach today were all primarily Namperumal Chetty's work, which we will see subsequently in this presentation. So the first Anglo-Mysore War. Now we spoke about the French coming to war against the British. Now Hyder Ali almost during the first Anglo-Mysore War almost came up to the gates of Fort St. George. I mean, this was being the first Anglo-Carnatic War, had the East India Company, the Nawab of Carnatic, and the Marathas on one side. And then there was Hyder Ali and the Nizam of Hyderabad on the other side. And the daring Hyder Ali, of course, there had been there had been a prior attempt that had happened in Pulalur, and when that had not been successful, this second time round, he came all the way up to the gates of Fort St. George, and the British were forced to sign the Treaty of Madras with him, that they would support each other in case there was an attack from anybody else, right? So now we come to the first newspaper that was brought out in the Madras Presidency. This was called Madras Courier, and this was primarily for advertising for the East India Company, and also it carried all the official notifications of the East India Company. And this was brought out from the Fort St. George, from the office which is where the Fort Museum currently is, right? Right. Now the introduction of the postal system. Now, prior to 1785, what was happening is, since the beginning of the 18th century, from 1712 onwards, they had this dark runner system. So there was an East India Company had an office in Kolkata, and then we were here. So there were runners who would run particular distances, carrying information between the two offices. And then the mails would reach Calcutta, and they would get the responses back to Madras. And all this was done at government expense. So what happened was, it's only in 1774, the East India Company started the system of charging postage. So till such time, even if it were private messages, they were being carried forth in the government expense. But then beyond that, from 1774, they started accepting private letters, and they started charging for the postage. So then they thought definitely now they needed a system and a network and a proper protocol by which these posts will be going between places. And so the first ever post office was established in 1785 in Fort St. George. And subsequently, and of course, at that time, it was inside Fort St. George. Subsequently, the building that you see in the picture, which is the Rajaji Salai post office building, was subsequently constructed. Now, this is the next step that you're going to be looking at. Again, a very significant development on the banks of the Coombe River. 1792, the private observatory that had been made, a person called William Peter had a private observatory on the banks of the Coombe at Egmore. And then when he was going back to London, he handed over all his equipment to the East India Company. And then a formal observatory was built again by the British on the banks of the Coombe in Nungambakkam by a gentleman called Michael Topping. So this building was a single room with 40 feet by 20 feet room with a 15-foot ceiling. And in the middle was this granite pillar, which you still see, and it has got inscriptions on all sides. It has got Latin, Telugu, Tamil inscriptions, which talk about the Madras Observatory being installed there. And from there, from 1793, they started making observations. And it was John Goldingham, who was the successor of Michael Topping, who determined the longitude at that point based on the eclipses of Jupiter's moon. And it was here, using this longitude as an indicator, that the Great Trigonometrical Survey was started by William Lambton. And I have put the inscription on the right side where you can see that it says, west to the center of this pillar, the center of the meridian circle of the Madras Observatory was a point 12 feet to the east of the center of this pillar. So this is where the Survey of India was started by William Lambton. Of course, another point is there on the St. Thomas Mount, which is on the banks of the river Adyar. Right. So this again will be of interest to you, I hope, the first engineering college. Now you can see that picture and you must be wondering, why have I put the Guindy Engineering College in a presentation where I'm speaking about the Coombe? Well, this engineering college originally was on the banks of the Coombe in Fort St. George. It was started as a school of survey with just one student who had enrolled and with Michael Topping as its head. And then it started in 1794, and then in 1858, it became the School of Civil Engineering. And from there, it was affiliated to the Madras University till about 1861, where the Faculty of Mechanical Engineering was added to it, and then it became a College of Engineering. And it was only much later that this new building was constructed on closer to the Adyar River that the engineering college moved to Guindy. So it started in near the Coombe and then moved near the Adyar River. Right. So in 1817, F.W. Ellis, who was then the collector of Madras, thought that it was important for the officers of the British officers to learn the local languages. Till such time, what had happened was there was this Dubash system. So there used to be a go-between person who would interpret messages from the British officers to the local people. And then whatever responses they gave will be conveyed again to the British officers. Now, what the Dubashas did was they made use of this opportunity. And in case the British officer wanted this person to pay 5 rupees, the Dubash would say, pay 10 rupees. And then they would pocket the 5 rupees. So at one point in time, the Dubashas had grown rich enough that they were actually constructing temples of their own. I mean, even kings had to raise money. They had to go on war, loot enemy territory, and then come back and construct buildings. But here what was happening is just individuals, merely by acting as translators, were constructing temples of their own. And so F.W. Ellis felt the need to for British officers to learn the local languages. So he started something called the College of Fort St. George. Now, all of us would know about College Road in Nungambakkam. College Road does not get its name from the WCC or the Women's Christian College. The Women's Christian College building at that time was not used as a college. It was actually used as Duckton House to house foreign prisoners, whereas the College Road gets its name from this particular building, which is inside the DPI, which was called the College of Fort St. George. Now, the College of Fort St. George also had its library, which is still among the oldest libraries in Madras, the Madras Literary Society Library. And for the common man, this would be the Maunaragam Library. So if you look at this library and tell someone, do you remember the library that came in the movie Maunaragam, then people will be able to easily connect to it. So this library was started, and they also started a society called the Madras Literary Society and brought out journals on various topics there. F.W. Ellis himself was a Tamil scholar. He was the first person to bring out a coin which had the image of Thiruvalluvar in it. So with the top knot and squatting on the floor, the image that you see in all the transport buses, and this, which is the common image of Thiruvalluvar that we have in our minds, was something that was mooted by F.W. Ellis. F.W. Ellis has also laid Tamil inscription. He developed 27 wells to give drinking water to Madras city. And he has inscribed a Tamil inscription in which he calls himself as Chennapattinathu Ellison, not as F.W. Ellis from London, but as Chennapattinathu Ellison. Right. So the next thing that we're going to be looking at is the Madras Eye Infirmary. So this was an eye hospital because there were a number of British soldiers and officers and clerks and peons who were here for a long time, and definitely they needed vision correction or get treated for problems with their eyes. So the first eye hospital, this is the oldest eye hospital in Asia, and of course the first eye hospital in India. And this eye hospital was, it was originally started in Veperi, and then it was moved to the present location in Marshall's Road in Egmore, right on the banks of the Coombe. And this hospital, surprisingly, right from the beginning started treating everybody. They did not have any reservations like, oh, it was only for the British. So it started treating everybody. And this building, you can see, was among the buildings that were built by Robert Chisholm. So this was the Madras Eye Infirmary, which was the oldest eye hospital in Asia, standing still very majestically on the banks of the Coombe. If you were to go, if you have an interest for museums, I would definitely request you to go and visit the museum in this particular eye hospital. You would see, samples and models from the 1800s as to how they were treating eye diseases and cataract surgeries and so on. Very, very interesting museum. Right. So the Madras Medical College, and the picture that you see on the screen, not a great picture, but that is called the Red Fort building, which is in the anatomy building for a very, very long time. The oldest building in the Madras Medical College. Madras Medical College was started as a private medical school by D. Mortimer, who was the superintendent of the GH in 1835. And it was regularized into, it had already been running, and in 1835, it was regularized into a proper medical school. This is the third oldest medical college in Asia, and it was the first medical college in the world to admit women students. Even prior to London, this was the first medical college to admit women students, and thanks to a medical doctor named Balfour. We will be speaking about Balfour in a short while from now. And the first lady student there was Mary Scarlett. She was the first doctor to graduate from there. And then, of course, the first Indian doctor to graduate from there was Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy, who needs no introduction. Kripabai Satyanathan, who is the first female novelist of India, also was a student of the Madras Medical College. Of course, she could not complete her education because of health reasons. But had she completed, she would have been the first Indian earlier to ahead of Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy. Right. Now the first lighthouse, now that is the Fort Museum building, and the first lighthouse had been set up on top of this building, which was nothing greater than a big light. And this had been set up because the harbor had already been developed at that time. So in 1842, there were a lot of commercial ships coming and going. So the need for a lighthouse had been felt. So the first lighthouse was set up here on the banks of the Coombe River. And then when this was not adequate, the second lighthouse was set up in a place where the Chennamallishwara temple and in Broadway, where originally the Chennakeswara Perumal temple and the Chennamallishwara temple were there. Since they had been destroyed due to fire, they were moved to their current location. And then the lighthouse was constructed there. That is still an archaeological monument that is being preserved by ASI. And then there was the third lighthouse, of course, is in the Madras High Court. And the fourth lighthouse is what you see in the Marina Beach. So of course, now this light is no longer there, but this is where the oldest lighthouse had been set up in on the banks of the Kuam River. Right. Now, a lot of commercial activity was going on, and everything was developing. The administration was now receiving money, and it was lending money, and it was giving grants. And so the need was felt for them to also create a bank. So what the British did was in 1843, they created 3 banks in Kolkata, Mumbai, and Madras. And the first was the Bank of Madras, and it functioned from Fort St. George, again from the place where the Fort Museum is. That building was called the Exchange Building because the bank was functioning from there. And then what happened was in 1921, they brought all the 3 banks together and called it the Imperial Bank. Now the Imperial Bank then functioned from this building that you see on your screen, which is currently the State Bank of India building, which was not built by Robert Chisholm, but it was built by Namperumal Chetty. And it continues to be there. Of course, the Imperial Bank became State Bank of India during nationalization, and it continues to operate from this heritage building. Right, the first government maternity hospital. Now in 1844, the need was felt for starting a lying-in hospital, because prior to that, the British women were only having babies at home. But then the need was felt because now there was a medical college, midwives were being trained in delivering babies. And so a small hospital was started on the banks of the Coombe River near the Egmore railway station, which was called the Lying-in Hospital. So this was a place where the British women would come for a few days of confinement and then would go back to their homes with their babies. Now, because of the demand for this hospital, they built a larger building in its current location on Pantheon Road, which is still called the Government Women and Children's Hospital. So that building, interestingly, was the shape of the building was like a woman's pelvis. So it was built there, and then it was moved out in the year 1881. And I was speaking about Dufton House earlier, where foreign prisoners were placed. So the last king of Burma had been imprisoned there, King Thibaw, and his wife had a baby. I mean, she conceived while she was at Dufton House, and she delivered her baby on the banks of the Coombe in this government maternity hospital. And then they were moved to Ratnagiri in Maharashtra, where they lived for the rest of their lives. This building requires no introduction because it still stays exactly the same way on Mount Road. Higginbotham's, the India's oldest bookstore, started by a gentleman called Higginbotham, and this continues to be, they continue to be booksellers and publishers. Hello? Yeah. So the Madras Literary Society felt the need for starting a museum. Hello? Can I continue? Yeah.
Yes,
so
you can.
I had some interruptions. Okay. So the Madras Literary Society in 1851 took over this private residence called Pantheon, which was an individual house and also subsequently became a banquet hall. They took it over and created the Museum of Madras. This was the second oldest museum in India and the 10th oldest museum in the world. And Edward Balfour, who was a medical doctor, was appointed as the first curator of this museum. So Balfour also started a zoo here. I mean, this was the first ever zoo in India. So he took over the Nawab's private collection and started a zoo here. So there used to be the museum which had the stuffed animals, and there were also the live animals that were placed here. And he was also a statistician who interestingly used to shift the animals to see when which animal was put in exhibit, how many people actually came here to visit the zoo. And then, you know, at one point in time, the collection grew so large that the people in the nearby vicinity started getting afraid. And so it was moved to People's Park in 1856. And sadly, when the World War happened, because the government was worried and the public were worried that if the bombs were dropped on the zoo and then the animals would all come out from their cages and kill everyone, all the animals were shot dead. So, but otherwise, this was the oldest zoo in India. And the second oldest museum in India was started here. And the museum continues to exist in the same building. And it was Balfour who actually negotiated with the East India Company to admit women students, because he saw that there was a large number of women who were dying at the time of childbirth because they were having home deliveries. So in order to institutionalize childbirth, it was Balfour who had negotiated with the East India Company to train midwives in a proper safety and hygiene measures at the time of delivering children, and also to admit women students in medical college. Right, we spoke a lot about Namperumal Chetty earlier. So Namperumal Chetty was a trader, he was a civil engineer, and he was a businessman. And he took over the work of Robert Chisholm and constructed all the other red stone buildings that you see, such as the Connemara Library. He constructed the High Court. So all the art gallery that you see in the museum. So the rest of the museum piece was all developed by Namperumal Chetty. Namperumal Chetty also had 99 houses in Chetpet. And he was one of the early purchasers of a motor car in Madras. He had a private tram for bringing his bricks, which he himself was manufacturing. And one thing I want to clarify here is Chetpet, although popularly believed, and Wikipedia says that it is named after Namperumal Chetty, that's not true. There are inscriptions from a time when even Namperumal Chetty's grandfather was not born, calling that place as Chettipedu and Setrupedu. So he was a great man, no doubt, but he did not lend his name to Chetpet. Right, so we spoke about Namperumal Chetty buying the first car. So Simpson, on the banks of the Kuam, produced all the means of transport that subsequently went on to the rest of India. So the first motor car was developed. Simpson initially was making coach carriages for the British, and then they developed the first diesel engine. So the first car was produced by them, the first tram. And in 1917, after the Wright brothers flew the first flight, the first ever flight in the world was flown on the banks of the Coam by De Angelis, who was a hotelier on Mount Road. And he flew this first flight on the island grounds area. So everything, and the flight was built by Simpsons, and it was flown on the banks of the Coam as well. So as far as transport is concerned, everything was pioneered on the banks of the Coam. Sudesa Mitran, for those of you who know Bharati and love his work, will be familiar with this name. The first Tamil newspaper, which was published out of Victory House on the banks of the Coam. Victory House is now the current VGP. You can still see in their address. They call themselves as VGP, Victory House. So this was the building, British building, which had been leased out, and Sudesa Mitran operated from there. Bharati worked there for a short while. Sudesa Mitran was a sister newspaper of the Hindu, and it brought out a lot of, at that time, it brought out a lot of articles which kindled the spirit of freedom in the people of India. Again, another first on the banks of the Coam, the Warwick Electric Theatre, the first ever theatre in India, was constructed on the banks of the Coam. This building might be familiar to a few of you. It's the Philatelic Bureau building in the post office on Mount Road near the Avi Theatre. And this was the first movie theatre in India and in Madras as well. Right. So we've seen a lot of, and of course, yeah, not to miss, the only place which was bombed during the First World War was on the banks of the Coam. A portion of the compound wall of the High Court was ripped away when a German ship called Emden dropped its bombs very stealthily on the 22nd of September night. And you can see those oil tankers burning. They were the tankers that were belonging to the Burma Petroleum Company that were bombed, and it was a scare to the British. And it was also, it was a face loss for them. And so this only place which was bombed during the First World War was also on the banks of the Coam River. Right. So we talk about the Coam being a dirty river, and we keep wondering who made it dirty. Every time the government announces a grant for cleaning up the Coam River, there are also a lot of debates and discussions about, can the river ever be clean? Who made it dirty? Whose fault is it anyway? It might reassure you to state that the Coam was quite dirty even towards the end of the 19th century. In fact, you know, the Mayor's Conversations lexicon described the Kuam River as a small and quite dirty river. And the book called Fort St. George, Our First Possession in India, written by a lady called Fanny Emily Penny, also describes that I don't know why Francis Day could have negotiated to purchase the fort of Santom itself. We don't know why he purchased the land next to this dirty river, and the river was already stinking of river weed. So the river was quite dirty for a variety of reasons, because the sewage, although originally Fort St. George had a plan of constructing dry toilets, eco-sand toilets, somehow that did not pass through. So they were letting out all the sewage from Triplicane and from Fort St. George and other places around it into the river. There was a lot of effluence from Chindadripet because of the dyeing, because of the people living there. That was let out into the river. And more importantly, because of the drinking water needs of Chennai city, because it was dammed in two places, the river bank was running dry, and with all the effluents moving very sluggishly, the river started getting very dirty. Now, in 1875, I mean, what I'm showing you on the screen are a series of letters. Of course, this is one letter, but Florence Nightingale wrote a series of letters to Napier and other officials of the East India Company. This particular letter is written to a gentleman called William Clerk. And William Clerk was a civil engineer, and he was an inventor who had invented, he was co-patentee for the road roller. He had already worked on the sewage of Kolkata. So she writes to him asking him to support with the creation of the sewage system for Madras. And in this letter, she says that, I hear about the high death rates, because there were a lot of death rates, because there was malaria, there was typhoid, and there was malaria, typhoid, and even cholera there. So to read here, the one point which one would wish for more information is on the Kuam question. It would doubtless be an enormous improvement to get Madras sewage out of it. Is not the Kuam foul because of the surface washings that get into it? Might I ask you how you mean to provide for this? In your kind note to me, and I trust keeping out, and you allude to this and trust to keeping out the sewage, which your scheme, there cannot be a doubt, will succeed in doing. So what had happened was the governor of Madras at that time, Lord Hobart, had died of typhoid. And so this became a key point for them to say that if they did not do something about treating the sewage and about ensuring that the river was cleaned up, more and more people, she gives the statistics saying 101 soldiers had died in 1874. And she says the estimate of 234,800 pounds, which was given as the estimate for the sewage system, is not a large amount for the work that they plan to do. And she signs the letter as your faithful servant, Florence Nightingale. So with her efforts, and because of the death of Lord Hobart, the governor at that time, the sewage system and the first pumping stations, the 3 pumping stations, were set up in Madras. Now, what is the challenge? Now, why is the Kuam not getting completely dirty? We'll have to look into this. Time and again, efforts are happening, and now the situation is far, far better, that a lot of STPs have been set up to completely treat the sewage before it enters the river. But the challenges that lay in front of us, this is the image of the Kesavaram Dam. So as I said, the first challenge is the water needs of Chennai. So we are tapping the water when it flows in the river, both at Kesavaram and at Korattur, and diverting it to the Chembrabakam and the Pundi reservoirs. If this did not happen, whenever it rains, the water will flow through the bed of the river, and the river will be able to clean itself as it did in 2015. But because that is not happening, there is no water in the river bed, you find that only the sewage water is entering it, as a result of which it's getting stagnated, and it is continuing to stink. And you find that originally there were even crocodiles in the Kuam River. The stuffed crocodile you can still find in the Madras Museum, called the Kuam crocodile. But now there is not a single species of fish or fauna that's available on the Kuam River, purely because of the toxicity of the river. So unless we find an alternative for the water needs of Chennai, the water is not going to flow through the water body of the Kuam River. The second key point, for which I really don't know when the solution will come is the encroachments that are there right inside the river. I mean, we keep hearing and seeing on the news about clearing of encroachments that happen time and again at the mouth of the river near the slums. But that is not the only encroachment. You find huge buildings have been constructed right inside the river itself, starting from Tiruvallur district. Unless and until those are cleared, the water is not going to flow smoothly and easily through the riverbed. And then there needs to be a foolproof sewage handling system. There should not be a single drop of untreated sewage that is entering the river. And this is not just for the Kuam. It applies to every single water body in India or in the world, that we cannot continue to afford to pollute the environment but by allowing untreated waste to enter our water bodies. And then the most important thing is a well-integrated approach with awareness both amongst the policy makers, also amongst the civil society and the general public. And everyone needs to understand that everyone is responsible to make the Kuam clean. If that happens, then this picture that you see on the left, which is a picture that was taken during the Kuam floods, where all of us are standing right inside the clean, crystal clear waters of the Kuam river, will be a reality, a day-to-day reality. And I would like to conclude this session by thanking Mr. Muthaiya. Now, but for him, we would not be celebrating the Madras Day every year. He created awareness, not just for the birth of the city, but also he is a pioneer in getting so much of information about the city that was sitting in vestiges, that was sitting in archived documents in a simple, understandable form. And then Madras Musings, with all its authors, Mr. Muthaiya, Mr. Sriram, and every other contributing author into Madras Musings, that have brought out all this information in encapsulated form for all of us to understand, enjoy, and pass on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.